Hello and welcome to That Encyclopedia podcast's third Spotlight episode, wherein one of us has read an article that we found interesting or we were otherwise knowledgeable about, and the other had it sprung upon them unexpectedly about 5 minutes ago. Today's discussion concerns a school of thought in international relations, which itself is a sub-discipline in politics, normally undertaken at university level. But hopefully it's not something that is as dry as it sounds, because it concerns current events quite closely, in my opinion. Today we are discussing realism, not the art movement or literary movement, but the discipline within politics. Will, when someone says that they're a realist to you, not in a political context, just, in general, what is your default interpretation of that meaning, that word?
It's hard for me to interpret, to be honest. It depends slightly on the context of the conversation, but obviously in the colloquial sense, it comes across as a person who might say, I don't lie on an optimistic or a pessimistic framework of thinking. I just, I like to see things as they are in an honest and neutral way. So I don't know, by instinct, in terms of a reaction to that, is a bit of a this person doesn't want to project emotion into a conversation.
That's kind of my reaction as well, right? Because it sounds like something so almost pompous when you really start to think about what it suggests. If someone says, I'm a realist, the implication is that I guess most people are not. Most people are fanciful and living in some fantastic world, and they're not taking things seriously or not intelligent or wise enough or experienced enough to otherwise make precise assessments about reality. And although that colloquial use of the term doesn't really have anything to do with realism, brackets, international relations, I get the same impression. I think it's not primed very well as a term for this reason. I think it sounds very high and mighty, and indeed it is an old and very well respected school of thought, and an enduring one at that. You can find examples of realist statesmen or thinkers, intellectuals, going back all the way into classical Greece and beyond. Nevertheless, I myself am not a realist. There are many theories and schools of thought within international relations, and if anyone commits themselves to the act of self-flagellation that is doing a politics and international relations bachelor's degree, they will receive a crash course education on all of the major ones, or at least I would hope so. But realism is possibly the most infamous, or at least the best known. Do you know anything about it specifically in this context at all?
So I've come across it once, and I used Control F on the Wikipedia article, and I typed in MEAR, and the first thing coming up, John Joseph Mearsheimer. I have heard of Mearsheimer because of some YouTube lectures pertaining to the war in Ukraine, and I think probably that's where the concept of realism in international relations has gained some more recent notoriety, and I think it's fair to say controversy as well.
So, which I am not familiar with that particular clip. I know who John Mearsheimer is. He's specifically one of the intellectuals behind the development of a sub-school of thought within realism itself called offensive realism, which we'll maybe put a pin in. But I haven't encountered him with respect to a viral clip about the war in Ukraine. What's he saying in that?
I'm not sure about a viral clip in particular, although there may be some. I've seen straight up 40-minute plus lectures
Okay, I
being
assume if
popularized.
someone mentions John Mearsheimer, like it must be viral, or they have no idea who he was.
No, I
But sorry,
think
go on.
it gives a good. So, I mean, it might be an unfair criticism of Mearsheimer himself. I don't know much about him. I've not watched these lectures in great length, but the association with what he's saying is that it gives a good backbone to people that would tend to distrust Ukraine and Zelensky's motivations in the Ukraine war, and provides, I guess you could call them some excuses for Russia's actions, which people would then describe as, oh, I'm just trying to give a realist interpretation of what's happening. Although I'm sure that that's where two terms of realism, two words that are the same but have different meanings, start to be slightly misused. And I'm not sure if Mearsheimer is actually an apologist for the Russian invasion of Ukraine or not. I've not paid enough attention to him, but that's sort of where I think it comes from. I mean, nowadays, anytime anything is big in the news, there has to be a fractional group of internet folks that try to dig up excuses to have an opinion that goes against the mainstream media perspective.
I see. Okay. I mean, this isn't the first time then that Mearsheimer would have given a few hot takes on Ukrainian-Russian relations. He quite infamously published an article, I think, in an academic journal, like not just some blog post or anything, called "Why the Ukraine." This is in reference to the 2014 annexation of Crimea. Why the Ukraine crisis is the West's fault, subtitled "The Liberal Delusions That Provoked Putin." And in this article, when he says liberal, he's not talking about it in the kind of casual sense that you might normally see on presidential debates or whatever. He means in the formal capital L political sense of liberalism, which is typically seen as the opponent of realism, where it starts from similar assumptions but reaches opposite conclusions about the way the world works. Because ultimately, all of these theories of international relations are kind of like lenses through which you see the world. And some scholars would say that you don't actually need a lens at all, or at least you don't need one that is predefined and understood. That used to be a very unpopular opinion. The counter-argument is that everyone has biases and everyone looks through certain lenses to interpret the world, and so if you don't use an established academic set that everyone understands, then anything you write is going to be obfuscated. But that's no longer considered as strong as an argument as it once was. But perhaps we can start with the four common assumptions of realism and build up from there. Because now that we've had the chance to explore kind of casually when people say they're a realist and the context that it normally comes up in, it's actually quite simple when you strip everything else away and you ignore current events and everything. The article has a good summary. Maybe let's see if you agree with its assessments, Will. How about that? So the first one is state centrism. States are the most important actors on a global level, that is to say. The article doesn't say this, but there's also an assumption of states as a black box, which is to say that what goes on within a state doesn't actually matter on the international level. What matters is how the state behaves with its neighbours. And so realism is not really concerned with domestic politics. It's purely concerned with international politics. And its primary concern is that states are the most important actors, more important than corporations that are valued in the trillions, more important than NGOs that have the backing of the UN, indeed more important than things like the UN and the EU itself. Only states. They're the most important. What do you think about that?
I think that there are I mean, as a generalization, that might work. I could see maybe some areas where it becomes a bit less clear. For example, there are obviously lots of powers within, say, the state of Russia that might influence how they behave on the world stage. But in terms of their hierarchy and the structure of how power within the state is exercised, I think for that reason, Putin has a lot more power over his state than, say, Rishi Sunak has over the United Kingdom. And for that reason, you could see that there's like a slight difference in terms of the politics and how you interact with Putin and how you appeal to his personal desires might matter a lot more in your interactions with the state of Russia than with the leader of a more sort of devolved power democratic system, if that makes sense. But I don't know if, I don't know whether like that's actually a flaw in realism or whether that's just a flaw in drawing a generalization from it. The other thing is, actually, you respond to that, then I'll say the next point I have on it.
Sure. I mean, you've kind of touched on it already, really. But the point you make about certain states essentially being run by fewer people, right, all the way up potentially to the level of it being a single person in charge, some dictatorial states, is an important one, because there's this assumption in realism that's tied to state centrism that says states are not only the most important actors and they're not only black boxes, but they're also fundamentally rational actors. This ties in a little bit with the third assumption that we'll come to, but it ties into the first one as well. States will behave in a way to pursue their own self-interest. And one of the criticisms of realism is that is not true unless you're arguing that humans are rational actors as well. Because if a human can run a state with supreme authority and absolute power, what happens if the human isn't rational? Are humans inherently rational people? If someone is to take a classic example, do some sort of Hitlerian maneuver and declare war on Russia whilst already fighting several powers, thereby essentially guaranteeing their defeat, that's not a rational decision for the state. So how does that assumption hold in those scenarios? That's one of the criticisms that you're kind of flirting with there. Mm-hmm.
Well, I'd say a couple of different things to that, though. The concept of like an individual or a thing being rational is, I mean, it's a strange one, and it comes into like a lot of economic interpretations of the world as well. But actually, I would say more or less, I think that is a reasonable concept. The concept that people and entities behave in a rational way, in the sense that like there is a reason for decisions being made. I don't think that there is a lot of sort of extreme lability in the behaviour of individuals or states. I mean, there'll be more so with individuals, but it's generally explainable if you do understand the worldview of the individual making the decision. That said, I had a second point on that, and I've already forgotten it.
Well, we can come back to it if it comes back to.
I mean, I have another point on the state centrism from what you were saying. Much earlier on it, about the concept of the sort of internal affairs in a state not being super relevant. That's definitely something that I would be hesitant to agree with. Again, it might be a good generalization, but I think the internal affairs of a state matter a lot in terms of the perception of other states to that state. So if you can see a country is going into an economic collapse, and that country is still attempting to strong arm you in a negotiation, especially if it pertains to like an economic thing, right? You're not going to be trade agreements are not necessarily going to happen if the person you're trading with has lost the thing that you're interested in, for example, right? So, I mean, that's a sort of a crude metaphor I could give is if the United Kingdom was being all very nice with Australia. Oh, we want a trade deal with Australia. We'll trade wool for something that you have, right? And they're behaving in one way. There would be two different potential realities. One where the United Kingdom maintains its grasp on the thing that Australia wants from the trade deal, and another where there's a disaster and all the sheep die and there's no wool left to trade. Now, the UK might behave the exact same way in both scenarios, but if Australia has the information about what's happening in the UK, that might alter their view on an interaction with the UK. But I think you can find like less extreme examples of that in terms of, say, China's behavior around Taiwan. I think internally you can alter things like, well, if your economy's doing well or badly, whether or not you've got a certain level of funding for your military, all of these things will affect your ability to exert power and influence outside of your own nation, and other nations can see that even if you don't alter your behavior.
So with that ought to say that this first assumption is quite a contested one.
Yes.
Like there's so much you can touch on, like absolutely. But what about the second assumption then, which is that the international system is fundamentally anarchic. We live in a state of anarchy. But that's the collective we. So you and I, we live in individual states which are not anarchic. They are bastions of order in a world that is fundamentally entropic. All this means it's essentially asserting that the state is the ultimate body, the ultimate judge, jury, and executioner, and if a state is misbehaving, the only thing that can make that judgment and force it to stop is another more powerful state. They would respond to the objection that you have bodies like The Hague or the UN things by pointing out that those are run by states working together, and so it's essentially just, three states in a trench coat.
Yes. So I was going to say that I think that this point would be sort of a straightforward, agreeable one, actually. But then I realised when you talked about it only being three states in a trench coat, how many states need to have bought into a system of organised authority for you to no longer consider international politics anarchic? And I think that's the question that's maybe not so straightforward. Although I think that certainly I could agree international politics is much more anarchic than any state with a government, a police force, an army, and a set of leaders. Because we don't really have. There's no real hegemony on the use of force to ensure certain things happen, and we can see that in the way how even the UN and the UN Security Council, it does not dictate whether you have war or peace. It can only provide a little bit of push or pull.
Okay, yeah, I think it's good. It's the least contentious one, I think. Its opposing theory, liberalism, largely agrees with these two assumptions as well. They just have different kind of conclusions about it. This third one, then, which we've already touched on, is perhaps the most controversial, and it's the assumption or the assertion of egoism, which says that all states within this anarchic system pursue their own self-interests, which means they pursue narrow interests. They don't really consider other states beyond how that will impact them. And moreover, they act in ways to maximize their own resources relative to everyone else. So they always want to be number one. Everyone's trying to be on top as much as possible. How about that?
That's, yeah, I have, again, I feel like these are nice generalizations, and I can see flaws in using them to make claims and put a lot of weight behind them. So as I mentioned earlier, and we discussed the difference between, say, a dictator and then actions on behalf of the state versus, say, a representative democracy, I think that again can be considered here. I think that people that run states act in rational self-interest, but that might create different outcomes for the state itself rather than the state acting in rational self-interest of the state. You have a case where every country with its own political system, those who run the political system are acting in their self-interest. So I would expect that in a more democratic country, you're going to have a better representation of sort of the entire populace of the state, and that arguably, if you have everyone in a state sort of collectively making a decision, that if those are all rational decision makers, then that's going to lead you to making a bit more of a state interest decision. Whereas if you've got a much less representative political system, let's again talk about Russia. Is the Russian government going to be acting in rational self-interest in terms of the entire Russian state? I don't know that it is. It depends how you define the concept of a state, really, when you get beyond that. Because I think that a dictator is going to generally act in his or her own rational self-interest. And that, generally speaking, in terms of political leaders, is the ability to hold on to power. So in a democracy, you do that by appealing to the electorate. But in a dictatorship, well, there's different push and pull forces that you need to deal with, and the public is one of them. But under an oligarchy, it's the oligarchs, and there are different ways to maintain control over them. But I don't think acting in Russia's best interests is necessarily the top thing, if that makes sense.
So yeah, the question here is, how are you whose interest is the self? Who is the self, and what is their interest?
Yeah.
And the standard responses are, well, it's to accrue as many resources as possible. But I think that just sidesteps the question, because then you say, well, what do you mean by resources? I mean, do you mean money? Because if for a situation like Ukraine, Russia has lost a ton of money. They're not making money out of this. Is it like international street credit? Whatever. But yes, I see where you're coming from there. And so the final assumption is that on an international basis, as opposed to, again, a domestic basis, which realism doesn't consider, on an international level, the primary concern of all states is the accumulation of power and the guarantee of their own security. In other words, states are incentivized to build up their militaries to survive in this anarchic system. Simply put, politics on an international level is ultimately about power, that vague and ever elusive word. What do we think?
I think that, again, we're on this one, on another, I would see that as a generalization. I think that is, for the most part, true. That, because having enough power to ensure self-preservation is among the interests of most of the general public and most political leaders, and I think that definitely manifests in the activity of the state. However, again, you've got another sort of vague and open to interpretation concept, the concept of power, and I don't think that is as simple as a country with a very large economy being able to strong arm people versus having a large military to strong arm people. I'm not sure that it's so clear that it is just a few of the major metrics that we're used to seeing. In fact, if I look at, I have an example in mind, but I need to fact check myself. So there are more than one. There are more than one nations that do not have armed forces. Now, if we're going to think about a country's ability to project power, does that really make much sense? Well, maybe if they've exchanged having a standing army for a massive economic benefit and economic leverage, possibly. However, I'm not so convinced from the history of some of these countries and the reason why they abolished their militaries, sort of the political campaigns and the political leaders. I'm not convinced that there's a secret underlying power desire that led to these decisions. I think there's, for example, in Costa Rica, a genuine movement towards a pacifist international relations stance. So I don't think that they did that for power. So I'm interested to hear what you think about that.
I think hearing your kind of gut reactions to these four fundamental assumptions, 4.5, people measure them in different ways, has been really interesting, because to me, the assumptions of realism are kind of like the IR equivalent of a horoscope, where they're just kind of vague enough to sound correct and to stand up to initial scrutiny, but there are so many little asterisks and nuances that there are really a lot of things when you dig into realism that it struggles to answer. The same's true of liberalism, actually, because it shares a lot of these assumptions. It just kind of throws in trade, mostly the power of finance, to mediate this quite militaristic perspective that realism is pushing you towards. There are a few problems, in my opinion. The first is, as you've already pointed out, this idea of states being a black hole or a black box. It was made very clear at the end of the Cold War, for example, that can have an enormous impact. The Soviet Union wasn't conquered; it collapsed under its own political weight. Whether you want to call that death by 1,000 cuts or some grand culmination of several things tying together, is sort of irrelevant. Realism did not predict the collapse of the Soviet Union, and could never predict it based on these assumptions. You also have this problem of realism only really considering the major powers in any given system, whereas I would argue that the international system is more fractal rather than it being a flat playing field. You struggle to find realist scholars who grew up outside of states that were also major powers on the international stage, and I think that can be quite telling. What I mean by that is, if you live in the United States, it's very intuitive to think of international relations in this kind of game theory sort of way, because the United States is the most powerful country on the planet. There's no one above the US on a one-for-one basis. But if you grew up in the Federated States of Micronesia, or the Seychelles, or Madagascar, or most countries, actually, if you chose one at random, do you really live in an anarchic world internationally? If you have these powers above you, if the S-tier countries are enforcing certain regulations on the A-tier countries, and the A-tier countries are doing the same to the B-tier countries, and all the way down the line, and I rank tiers here strictly in terms of power and nothing else. If you live in a D-tier country on this power org chart tier list, do you really live in a fundamentally anarchic system any more than you or I do, because we have the I don't know, maybe if you pay rent, you have the landlord above you and the police above you and the state above you and all of this. I think there are very good arguments that you could make that argues that for most states, the system is not fundamentally anarchic de facto, even if it seems like it is de jure. And finally, in a similar vein, realism has a tendency to treat these non-S tier countries as nothing more than pawns or poker chips or matchsticks or whatever metaphor people like to use. They choose different ones to be shuffled amongst the main power players. And this is where Mearsheimer's criticism of Ukraine, I think, falls down. Because Mearsheimer's criticism in his 2014 article was essentially that the Western powers had been meddling in Eastern Europe by like democratizing it and whatever. And this made Putin and Russia, and whatever you want to call it, that sphere of influence suspicious and angry. You poked the Russian bear, essentially. That's the argument. But such an argument completely neglects to treat Ukraine and indeed the whole of Eastern Europe as anything more than a pathetic pawn of these two major powers. And if you actually look at the history and development of the cultures of these places, they're anything but that. They are completely capable of making their own decisions, so to speak. And realism struggles to acknowledge that and struggles to accept that. It kind of boxes these states into groups owned by more important or more powerful players. And it's not capable of seeing or treating states in any other way. And that's just not true, in my opinion. Those are the main criticisms of realism in like a speed summary fashion. But nevertheless, whenever someone talks about the concepts of realpolitik, or mentions Machiavelli or Thomas Hobbes and his 1651 work Leviathan, or Hans Morgenthau or John Mearsheimer or Hedley Bull or anyone like that, they are essentially referring to realism. It is an extremely influential school of thought, and I don't claim to have just destroyed it in 5 minutes or anything. There are counter-arguments to my objections, and back and forth it has been going for literally thousands of years at this point.
I mean, if I could add a closing word as we move to the end of this interesting discussion, so thank you for choosing this subject. I think the main issue that comes up in the popular interpretation, or possibly, I mean, I don't know whether it's the intent or whether it's just how it looks to someone that doesn't understand this kind of discussion, which I could fall into, that when Mearsheimer says, it's the West has done these things and it is the mistakes of the West that have led to this happening, the issue I also take with that is, irrespective of how you describe the events, if two people have interacted and an outcome has happened, well, that outcome quite possibly required both parties to interact, but it does not place moral responsibility on both equally. You wouldn't say, oh, well, a victim of bullying is responsible for that by knowingly being within the presence of a bully who will look for people with their traits, right? I mean, that you can describe the world and you can look at how decisions were made that influenced others' decisions, but at the end of the day, I'm unlikely to take a sympathetic view of the Russian state actions, because I just don't think that the way Putin behaves is moral. So you might think that it is the West's fault and that the West could have done politics in a slightly more clever way to prevent this escalating. Maybe they could, but for two reasons: the right of Ukrainian citizens living in a democracy to maintain that, and an objection to Putin feeling like he had to do something and therefore becoming a warmonger. I think that I can take moral objection to an interpretation that lays blame on the West, say.
Indeed, and the realist kind of response is that they don't only make assumptions about the nature of states, but also this fundamental Hobbesian assumption about the nature of humans. And it says in the article, I'll quote it, it says, realists think that mankind is not inherently benevolent, but rather self-centered and competitive. They view human nature as egocentric, which is slightly different from selfish, but is near enough as makes no matter, essentially conflictual. And so realists don't really comment on morality. It's very much a might makes right perspective. And in the abstract, I think that's a valid perspective to have, in the sense that you could defend it in a formal argument. But I am very wary of people who throw around those claims with a sense of pride and sort of immunity almost. Like this idea of, well, morality is a cage and it's just an illusion and you should grow up, sort of thing. I think that's a very kind of childish, puerile response, which is a shame, because the actual assumption itself, as I say, could be quite well defended.
Well,
but it's just deployed badly.
Yes, that's where I see it becoming a potentially sort of dangerous argument to try and make, because, like, as I said, let's say that what if everything that Mearsheimer said about why things happened was correct? Well, the problem is that followers of him will then go on to moralize from it, and to moralize that, oh, well, we did wrong and caused this problem, so we don't have, it's not like we have any moral imperative to protect Ukraine, because we're just continuing to cause agitation to Russia. I mean, I think people will moralize based upon the language used, and if the language is, oh, it's your fault, then that creates some problematic implications for intervention in the future. But
well,
yes, we've had a long discussion of pretty much just the first segment of this page. But,
absolutely, it could, but all good things must come to an end.
So, thank you very much for listening, and we'll see you next time.